What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
Welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. Here we dive into topics that matter to those who are seeking life of a greater purpose. I'm your host, Helen Todd. Life on a mission is full of unexpected twists and turns. It's a journey out of your comfort zone. It requires faith. However, we often overlook the aspect of preparation when it comes to a journey of faith. If you have heard some of my previous interviews, I frequently talk to people who have traveled on a short-term mission trip with World Missions Alliance to the world's hotspots, and their testimonies highlight the joy, the fulfillment, the excitement of serving the Lord in the Great Commission. But on rare occasions, things don't go exactly as planned. And the outcome and the consequences of these unforeseen circumstances can be mitigated by some steps you can take in advance. Today, you will hear the first-hand account of Shelvie Burks, who experienced an unforeseen setback during her mission trip to Ireland. Having proper travel and medical insurance not only helps Shelvie navigate seamlessly through the challenges of having a surgery overseas, but also gave her an opportunity to share Christ with someone. After my conversation with Shelvie, you will hear a few practical and helpful tips on properly insuring yourself before international travel from James Pruss. James is the director of Noah James Insurance Agency and has many years of experience in providing travel and medical coverage for missionaries. Hello, Shelby. Great to have you on the Limitless Spirit podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fine today, and it's good to see your face.
So we haven't talked in a while, but a couple of years ago, God called you to go on a mission trip to Ireland with World Missions Alliance. So how did that happen? Why Ireland?
Basically, because Ireland, it didn't take too many hours to get there. And since I'm, 80 years old, I can't travel like a whole day and night to get somewhere.
You have been on trips with our organization before. What are some of the countries that you went with us?
Yes, I went to China.
Russia?
What was the last one we went?
Well, I think you have traveled with us to Russia and China and...
India.
Goodness, India, okay, and
yes,
India.
That's the one I was trying to think
that's
of.
Right.
India.
We have known each other for a very long time.
Yes, yes.
So Ireland and missions are on your heart because you serve as a missions director at your church. And so you basically chose Ireland for practical purposes because This is where you felt you physically could travel. Was there anything else that made you particularly excited about sharing the gospel in Ireland?
Well, I think some of my ancestors were from Ireland, but I'm not sure what area. It wasn't Cork, but I think it was up maybe Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Well, your story and the reason I wanted us to talk today is a good example that sometimes things happen not exactly the way that we intend. From the natural perspective, it could appear like a complete disaster because what happened literally the second day that you got to Ireland?
Well, actually, it was on the third day because the first day we went up to Dublin and then we came back. And then the second day we did ministry there in Cork. And then on Saturday, which was the sightseeing day, a couple of us ladies, we went downtown to the coffee shop. And coming back, it was raining pretty hard. And we were walking fast. And I just got ready to say, I need to take a breath. And then my legs slipped out from underneath of me. And then I couldn't get up. And so this nice barber who was right across the street came over. He picked me up. And when I saw him, I thought, He was tall and thin, and I thought, this man ain't never going to be able to pick me up. But he just reached underneath of me, picked me up like a little baby, took me across the street, put me in his chair, and then we sent for your husband.
So you ended up in the hospital and they discovered that you broke your hip?
I broke my hip. Yes, ma'am.
The interesting thing is, again, it may look like a complete disaster from the outside perspective, but as you know, many of the countries where we travel and minister, they don't have very good medical care. There are certain countries where had this situation happened, I would have been very concerned for you to end up in a hospital in this country. But, you just happen to be in a country that has an excellent medical care.
Oh, yes. And excellent.
The hospital where they brought you was also very well known for the services that they provide. So what were your feelings at first when you realized that you're not going to be mobile for the rest of the trip?
Actually, I guess I was very calm about it, and it's like, okay. I mean, I was in a lot of pain before they took care of it. I don't know. I guess I just trusted God, He had a purpose, and I just, okay, if I have to spend 6 days in the hospital, I'll just make the most of it.
We didn't mention the fact that you came on this trip with your grandson. This was one of the special things for you about this trip, that you got to travel with your grandson to Ireland.
Yes.
So did you feel disappointment that when you realized that you're not going to leave the hospital for the whole duration of the trip?
No, I didn't feel disappointed. I guess I just took it all in stride. My biggest worry was that I would not be able to come home on that flight that we were scheduled to come home on. And so when I got in touch with the person from the insurance company, his name was Daniel, and he was actually, his office was over in London. So I wrote down a note or two because we kept in touch for about a year. And actually, when he showed up at the hospital, I just remember saying, "Oh, you're my angel from heaven." Because I was so...
Wait, he flew from London to Ireland, to Cork, to see you at the hospital. That is pretty incredible.
Yes. He was my traveling nurse. So when I spoke to the agency, apparently I must have said something that struck his heart, because he told me that he told his supervisor that he had to go and meet me. So it must have been something I said. He said, "I just have to meet that lady." And so we met and we kept in contact for a while. And when I got well enough to go back to church and go to Bible study, I was telling him this. And then I said, "And speaking of Bibles, do you have one?" And he said, "No." And so I asked him if I could send him one. And he said he would love to get a Bible from me. And could I highlight some verses because he was raised Catholic, but he's not a practicing Catholic. And so he said, yes, he'd love to have a Bible. And could I mark some scripture verses that we read in our church? So apparently he just had that mindset of the Catholic Church where they just read scripture. But anyway, I typed up a bunch of scriptures and sent it to him. And so I haven't heard whether he has read the Bible or if it's had an impact in his life, but I just keep praying for him.
Well, that is quite extraordinary, because it seems like God had a very special assignment for you.
Yes, he did.
He allowed you to go through a major trial, but as a result, he connected you with the person that you most likely wouldn't have ever encountered or connected with otherwise.
Right. And so when we got to London, we went into the area where they have seats, where it's private, the club area. And so we were looking for 4 seats together, because there was 4 of us, because one of the men from my church went with us, John Hall. And so we were walking down the aisle, and there weren't any, almost all the seats were taken. And we came to this one little area where there were 4 leather chairs, but there were 2 ladies sitting there. And the two ladies got up and left. So we had the 4 chairs. So Daniel says to me, he says, he pointed to heaven and he said, he answered your prayers because we got those seats. But I couldn't tell him that I didn't pray for us to have, for God to give us those seats. But anyway, so I must have been talking to him all along about the Lord.
Obviously, you made a deep impression on him.
Yes.
Whatever you told him. But we skipped a little bit ahead in your story.
Yeah.
So when they discovered that you broke your hip, the doctors wanted to do a surgery on you right away. And so was it a hip replacement surgery that they did, essentially?
Well, in the layman's term, it's a partial hip replacement. So I'm not sure what part they replaced. But when they took me to the emergency room, they were in there in just a few minutes, did the x-rays, came back, said, yes, your hip is broken. And the orthopedic surgeon came in less than an hour, and said, your hip is broken. We'll have to do surgery. We'll put you on the schedule for tomorrow. So I did pray that I would be the first one. And God answered that prayer because I was the first one, which gave me longer time because the doctor said, if you can't be up walking, we can't let you go home. And so that was my prayer, that I would be the first one. So then I would have longer time to rehab so I would be able to walk.
So, and at what point did they ask you whether you had any travel insurance?
I'm not sure. They probably asked me right away. I'm not sure. Yeah, I had my card with me, so.
It is because of this policy that you had, they covered your expenses in the hospital, they assigned you a travel nurse, they covered an upgrade on your flight back into business class, and your travel nurse brought you all the way from Ireland to your home.
To my living room, yes.
To your living room. That is one of the reasons I wanted us to record this interview, because I was so impressed. I don't think we have had a case like this before in the 25 years of the history of our organization. And this was a very great example of how, that things can go wrong, even if we take all the precautions, but how important it is to be protected, and we were incredibly impressed by how they took care of you. But in addition to all that, what makes your story so special is that God still had an assignment for you in Ireland, and you fulfilled it.
Yes, He did.
So I find that a story quite extraordinary. And so did your insurance cover all the expenses associated with this?
Everything. I didn't pay a dime.
So that is incredible.
At first, I was told that I would not be charged anything, that the city was going to pay for, because the accident happened on the city streets. And so I did get some paperwork from the hospital, and I just sent it right on to the insurance company. And I think that I communicated with the hospital and told them, this is where you need to send all your bills. And so after that, I have not heard anything. I've not gotten any bills. So I just assume everything's been paid for.
Well, I have to ask you, Shelby, how are you feeling now? Are you completely recovered?
Yeah, I'm feeling very well with the hip. I'm just having some other older age issues. So anyway, I still want to go on a mission trip, but.
Well, and if the Lord calls you, we would love to have you, Shelby. I love your heart for missions. I love the fact that nothing stops you from answering God's call. What advice do you have for people who feel called or answer God's call to do something and find themselves in a situation where things don't go exactly the way that they had planned?
Right. Well, God's word says we make plans, but God has other plans. Our plans are not His, and His plans are sometimes not ours. When I went to, I think this was China that we went with somebody else. I don't think we went to China with Chuck. But there was a lady there then, and I was younger then, and she was 80 years old. And so I just kept in my mind, well, if she could do that, I could do that. I mean, age should not keep you from responding to God's call.
And so what did you do when you were 80? You went on a mission trip.
I did. But I think it was like 2 years before. I knew that I didn't know I was going to Ireland at that time, but I knew that I wanted to go on a mission trip. And so I had knee replacement. And I probably talked with you about the knee replacement because I knew I couldn't walk unless I had a good knee. So that's what I did to prepare for this trip to Ireland, was have knee replacement. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, but you do what you got to do. And whatever God is calling you, you just got to go.
You just say yes.
Yes. And when I asked Joshua, my grandson, I just said to him, Joshua, would you like to go on a mission trip to Ireland? I don't remember if I said Ireland. And he said, well, I'll pray about it. And so I didn't say anything more to him. And then like 2 weeks later, he came back to me and said, yes, I'd like to go. So that was a wonderful thing, because when I was in the hospital, he and the lady from Washington, who was a nurse, the two of them came up to visit me. And when they got ready to leave, she said, well, let's say a prayer. And so Joshua just jumped right in and said this Holy Ghost prayer that I've never heard him pray, and I thought, if that's the only reason to go to Ireland was to hear him pray like that, then it was worth every penny that I spent. And I'm hoping that he will go on another trip someday.
Well, thank you so much, Shelby, for your story. I find it very inspiring. I've shared it with a number of people just as a reminder that, God's plan is always perfect. His timing is always perfect. And
yes, it is.
He rewards people who are faithful to him. And I know that you're reaping his rewards in this life and in eternity for being a faithful servant.
Yes,
Blessings to you, and I look forward to more missions adventures together with you.
Okay, and I would encourage everybody to get travel insurance.
Good thought. James, welcome to the Limitless Spirit podcast. How are you today?
Great, Helen. Nice to see you.
Well, I'm excited about our conversation because I feel it's extremely practical, especially for people who love to travel, particularly for people who love to travel internationally for missionary work. And this is mostly people who listen to this podcast. So We've known each other for a few years. We actually crossed paths at a medical missions conference in Texas. And ever since have been connected, where we just recommend you as one of the insurance agents to provide coverage for our missionaries. But I don't know a whole lot about you, James. Do you mind sharing with our listeners a little bit about yourself?
I'm a native Bostonian, but moved eventually here in Texas. I'm in the Houston area. I ended up in in between that, I lived in Vietnam and in Singapore, worked in the medical travel and security assistance sectors. I worked for one of the largest providers, actually the largest in the world for those services, and really fell in love with the business. And so that when I came back to Houston, I set up my own insurance brokerage, Noah James Insurance, and then realized here in Houston, one of the biggest markets was mission trip travel medical insurance. So I started tapping into that market. And it's been very enjoyable as well. For me, it's not just business. It's, of course, I like to see great results and people get the coverage they need. But I have a particular interest in mission trip travel because the work that's being done is so good. And I feel a lot of gratification doing this.
I am very happy to hear that. And I always enjoy working with people who are in love with what they do. So let me ask you this. What makes you love what you do?
Seeing the success stories. So, I've witnessed medical evacuations, which is typically one of the major components of a travel insurance policy. So I have been part and witnessed a successful medical evacuation. In fact, my son, as an infant, was medically evacuated from Vietnam. So I know how harrowing the experience can be. But if done correctly, it's really so necessary to have that included in an insurance policy. And we actually, did that as well for your organization, for one of the travelers from Ireland. And I do remember that case. It was an older woman who had broken her hip. And I was really satisfied to see that it was properly executed, the medical evacuation on a commercial jet. The whole case was handled really, really nicely. And things like that are great to see. Great outcomes.
Well, this is actually one of the stories why I even wanted to do this interview, because, people don't always understand the value of obtaining insurance. I think that, even for me, sometimes people think, well, I'm healthy. I never get sick. I'm fine. I can deal with travel delays. It's not a big deal. But, sometimes we can't anticipate things going terribly wrong. And that story that happened to Shelvie Burks, one of our missionaries that traveled with us to Ireland, is a great example and really solidified the fact that we highly, highly recommend for everyone who goes on a mission trip with World Missions Alliance to consider both medical and travel insurance. I'm certainly glad that Shelby went ahead and contacted you and did purchase this protection, because it could have been a very, very disastrous situation. So what would you say are the main reasons that people don't think about why having this insurance coverage is very important?
Well, sometimes people are under the false impression that their U.S. insurance is portable. In other words, it moves with them wherever they go. So that, I can tell you, is in 95% of the cases is not a fact. So your U.S. health insurance, unless you're a veteran with certain benefits, does not travel with you, cannot be used overseas. And then even if you are a veteran with this benefit, it's typically pay and claim. So if you, for example, had some situation in a foreign country, they would require payment first. And if that was surgery, let's say it was, it could be whatever the amount, $10, $20, $30, $40,000, they're going to require that you pay that up front. That's a very uncomfortable situation for most people, and you don't want to be involved in that. It's also going to limit where you are treated, because obviously if you require medical evacuation, that could be another $100,000 to $250,000 or more. Most people don't travel with a couple hundred or $250,000 or whatever it is, and do not want to even think about that. So an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, whatever the expression is, it really applies. And basically, people can figure that the trip insurance will be somewhere between 5 to 10% of their non-refundable trip cost, because that is what it covers, about 5 to 10%. That is the cost typically, 5 to 10% of the non-refundable costs.
So what are some of the things people should take into consideration when choosing a plan, a coverage plan? What are some practical ways to help them determine how much coverage do they actually need?
Well, there's a few really critical things to consider. One would be, who is the provider for the medical evacuation? That is really critical. I work with 19 different providers. I do not recommend all 19. There are certain ones which are much better at executing these services than others. And the average traveler is not going to know which one is better. So that's number one. Second of all, medical evacuation and repatriation is a must. Typically, I recommend, it depends on the destination, but typically between $200,000 and $250,000 in medical evacuation, because that cost, the aircraft alone, the medical jet, could easily be $100,000, $150,000 or more, depending on where you are. Second of all, inpatient medical expenses. Those are like the two key benefits that must be included in every policy. Then you also have trip delay, cancellation, lost and stolen bags. Those are all the peripheral benefits that would be recommended and are included in every policy. But the medical is really first. And outpatient is also covered. And that would be typically pay and claim. Inpatient typically would be direct billing, so it's cashless. The traveler doesn't have to pay anything out of pocket.
Some people also would like to know if they have an option of trip cancellation insurance because perhaps they're uncertain of their plans or they have a loved one who is in critical condition and they don't know what's going to happen. So that's a question that comes up frequently.
Right. So trip cancellation, now, if it's due to a death in the family or illness in the family, they don't need to take a separate trip cancellation coverage because trip cancellation can really significantly increase the cost of the premium by about 60 to 70% more to have that add-on feature where the traveler can just say, I don't feel like going on this trip, I'm going to cancel. So I would say 95% of the people do not choose that benefit because of the cost. One other thing I almost forgot to point out is that every single plan that we sell has COVID coverage for COVID-related illness, and it has an extension of benefits so that if you're overseas and you become ill, it will pay all the expenses for up to 3 weeks, sometimes more, until you return home. It'll even rearrange a flight for you and pay for it.
That was a big blessing to have that policy during the pandemic years because we continued to travel and we made it mandatory for all the travelers. But it's interesting to know that that policy is still in place and is being offered because, people still get sick with COVID. So that is good to know. I know that we always feel like, oh my goodness, this will never happen to me. But I'm sure as an insurer, you have seen some horror stories of people who found themselves in a bind without being insured. Can you share some of the examples?
Yeah, there's one example that comes to mind. There was a Korean traveler. I was living in Asia at the time, and there was a traveler who had no insurance, and he wanted to be repatriated from Vietnam to Korea, his home country. He wanted to go back there for medical treatment, and he had to pay out of pocket $200,000 for a charter jet for an air ambulance to return home because he would not be treated locally. So that's one example.
So what happens is if a person literally doesn't have that amount of money?
If they do not have those funds, then they are at the mercy of the local hospital system, which is why you really need to have insurance, because what happens is the medical director from the insurance company will make sure that you get treated. He'll move the case to wherever he thinks is the best place for you to receive treatment. They call it the nearest center of excellence.
And of course, when you go on a mission trip, more often than not, it's a country where maybe medical care is not up to the standards, and especially
Correct.
if it's a very serious condition. Like in case of Shelvie Burks, broke her hip. Of course, she was in Ireland, which has quite a nice medical care. So that was fortunate, but still, it would have been a disaster had she not, financially for her, had she not had this coverage. So when it comes to travel insurance, we talked a lot about the medical insurance. What are some of the things that you highly recommend for people to make sure is included in their coverage?
Well, on the medical insurance side, you want to have doctor's bills, inpatient, outpatient, x-rays, exams, lab tests, medications, pharmacy, COVID coverage, which I mentioned, extension of benefits for COVID or any other illness while, contracted while abroad. So those would be the medical benefits that you want to have. And then on the travel side, you want travel delay, misconnection, cancel for COVID, sickness, interruption, and trip cancellation and interruption. Like those are just also hurricane and terrorism. So that's just a quick list of what is typically included in every policy at some limit.
And so one more aspect I wanted to touch on, James, when it comes to making a claim, I know that there is the right way to go about it and the wrong way to go about it. So What would you say are most important things for people who purchased an insurance plan to know in the situation where they do have to make the claim?
Right. So what happens, I would say, definitely keep all your receipts, particularly for outpatient services. Keep everything, keep every receipt. And then when you return, or even if you have time while you're abroad, you can file online. You can file the claim online, submit the claim online, because it typically can take between anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks for the insurer to respond and adjudicate the claim. So that's typically what can happen. So I just would say, make sure you keep your receipts, and most, if not all, of the major insurers have an online portal for filing.
When it comes to the travel issues and the medical too, other than the receipts for the services, what other documentation is important to have to support the claim?
Really just the receipts. There's no other documentation that typically, they're just going to need receipts for services rendered would be it. Now, in the case of medical, where if it's a direct billing situation now that's different because it's cashless. So the insurer is going to agree that service should be provided, and they're going to go ahead and arrange the payment on your behalf, which means, of course, that is why it's called cashless. So that's an exception there. So anything inpatient typically would be cashless, surgery, or even any type of hospitalization.
What about the lost luggage coverage or the travel delay coverage?
That would be claim. So basically, in most cases, insurers will rely on you to tell them what the value of the items are that were lost, and there's a limit. So they might say that each piece of luggage they'll give you up to $150 or $200, and for the items maybe another $100. And they do not fight you. They're going to believe what you say. If you have like a picture of a damaged piece of luggage, just take the picture. If it's lost, file a police report so that you have some evidence, but they're never really going to dispute what the value of the contents are. They just don't typically.
I have another question, a scenario that frequently occurs during our trips. So, for example, a traveler is on their way to the mission and something happens, let's say a snowstorm that creates major travel delays, and the airline is not providing transportation for the traveler. Well, like in case of a snowstorm, we had a situation where a traveler was delayed 3 days in arrival, according to the airlines, by which time they felt like it didn't even make sense for them to travel. So what would happen if that person was insured? What would happen when he made the claim?
Yeah, so what happens is the traveler should call the toll-free helpline. Every insurer has a toll-free 24/7 helpline. And then the insurer will help you make arrangements to get on another flight. They'll also help you with payment if necessary. But most of the time, they'll just ask you to pay it, file the claim, which they will pay back whatever extra costs are incurred. But if it's something about like helping you with the logistics of obtaining or getting another flight, sometimes they will do that as well because they provide travel and medical assistance, these providers. So they will get involved in that as well. And they're 24/7.
Well, this is very helpful. So in conclusion, James, what would you what advice would you give, aside from the fact, go ahead and get the insurance? What advice do you have for people who are getting ready to travel?
Yeah, I would say travel smart, travel safe, and travel insured. And in a nutshell, that's what I would say. And I would say that everyone needs coverage. It's the same. I've seen people say, I don't need health insurance. I'm very healthy. Well, something can always happen. We don't plan on getting sick. We don't plan on anything happening, but it's important to have. And some countries also may ask for some proof of valid insurance coverage in home country, also for travel, rather, I should say. May ask. So don't take the chance and make sure you're covered.
Thank you so much, James. You've given very helpful advice, and I look forward to continuing working with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Helen. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to Limitless Spirit Podcast. Listening to Shelvie reminds us that preparation is key when answering the call to serve others. I want to mention that in less than 2 months, April 3rd through 5th, World Missions Alliance is hosting our annual Greater Purpose Conference in Branson, Missouri. And if you are looking for opportunities to serve, if you want to become involved in short-term missions, or perhaps you just need to be encouraged in your faith and inspired, this is a perfect event for you. Also, this year, it will mark the 25th anniversary of World Missions Alliance helping people like you find their greater purpose in life. It will be a grand celebration. Just visit our website, rfwma.org, and find out more information about the conference. Register. We hope to see you in Branson. Stay safe, stay covered, and stay tuned for more insightful discussions on Limitless Spirit Podcast. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.